Let's take you back to our conversation. This is with my next guest, who says anti-corruption laws, of course, should be revised in the sense that currently what happens is that those who have power and influence are able to argue, at least legally, their way out of the courts, whereas that same opportunity is not afforded to those who don't have access to the same amount of resources. And Sabeehah, you are with Corruption Watch, of course, and you've been using South Africa as a case study for making this argument. And part of what you're saying is that what we're seeing in post-democratic South Africa is that things are not changing, especially when it comes to the ability of those in powerful positions to evade accountability.
Yes, that's correct. And I don't know how much you heard before I unfortunately got cut off, but one of the great examples of that is the former President Jacob Zuma, who's been supposedly compelled by a court order to attend the Zondo Commission and testify, which, as we know, hasn't been sort of implemented yet. Whereas when you have these kind of laws and rulings against sort of ordinary citizens who don't have access to the same financial resources or political influence, these laws come down very hard on them. And this can show a huge imbalance in terms of not only how the law applies to people, but people's access to actual justice. Justice is expensive for many in terms of going through the court processes. And so it's difficult for sort of ordinary people to be able to defend themselves or to equally access the law.
Mm. And if we were to have a more human rights-centered approach in accountability or in holding people accountable, how different would that look?
So the argument around human rights is essentially a rethinking of what corruption is and what corruption does. A lot of the time we see corruption as simply something financial or economic where money is changing hands. But for many people, it's actually about access to basic human rights, which are enshrined in our Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Corruption can prevent access to, for example, the provision of housing or education, and often also the right to dignity. Some people are being made to pay for healthcare or for essential services that should be provided by the government for free. So human rights framework of corruption would then make that link between corruption and access to human rights and application of human rights. And it would completely change the viewpoint of how we see corruption. A lot of people see corruption as sort of high level, involving politicians and very wealthy people and businessmen and multinational corporations. But the kind of corruption that Corruption Watch receives reports of on a daily basis is affecting the ordinary South African or the ordinary person living in South Africa. Where they are really struggling to access human rights without being extorted in some way or the other. So the human rights framework is really to readjust our view and see it more as a human issue rather than just a financial or money changing hand.
So Sabeehah, if I'm hearing you correctly, you are saying that there needs to be greater emphasis on perhaps the individual who has not accessed their house because of corruption, the person who doesn't have access to water because of corrupt contracts that have been taken, and that taking that particular view might in fact result in greater justice for those individuals whose lives continue to be not just severely affected, but they continue to be marginalized and stay on the fringes of our society because they're being denied that access.
Yes, exactly. Oftentimes the stories that make our newspapers are the ones that are sort of sexy, so to speak. The ones that are involving huge amounts of money, because huge amounts of money, of course, it's important to acknowledge that kind of money is being taken from our system, from our fiscus, and also indirectly then impacts on the realization of human rights when funding is diverted. But at the same time, there are real faces and real human beings who are directly being affected and whose rights are being denied as a result of corruption. And both of these stories are important. But at the moment, the larger sort of scene is given to these high-level, very, very huge amounts of corruption that's happening in comparison to the low-level corruption or the everyday sort of corruption. And the idea of giving a platform to sort of these stories of ordinary people is that other people can recognize themselves in it and say, you know what, this happened to me. Perhaps there's some way we can band together and come together as a South African community or community living in South Africa to then push these issues to the fore because it's something happening on a daily basis to people in this country.
All right, let's leave it there for tonight. Sabeehah Motala is from Corruption Watch.